Değerli misafirler, hepiniz hoş geldiniz. Bugün dünya siyasetinde Orta Doğu ve Arap uyanışı konulu panelle başlıyoruz. Tabii birkaç noktaya dikkat etmek gerekirse, bugün dünyamız önemli bir değişim süreci yaşıyor. Bunun başında da özellikle Arap Baharı diye adlandırılan, yani Arap dünyasındaki köklü dönüşüm. Bu da belki bir tarihsel çerçeveye kısaca oturtursak, Sayın Dışişleri Bakanı'nın belirttiği gibi, özellikle Osmanlı'nın yıkılmasından sonra bölge Arap dünyası ciddi bir sömürge ve Batı müdahalesi yaşadı. Ve daha sonra, İkinci Dünya Savaşı'ndan sonra özellikle bölge ülkelerinin bağımsızlığını kazanmasından sonra ortaya çıkan rejimler, genelde bu Soğuk Savaş döneminde diktatörlükler idi. Ve demokrasi gelmesi gerekirken bu süreç ertelendi. Yine Sovyet bloğunun yıkılmasıyla, Doğu bloğunun yıkılmasıyla, Soğuk Savaş'ın sona ermesiyle Doğu Avrupa'da, hatta Balkanlarda demokratikleşme süreci yaşanırken bu süreç maalesef yine Arap dünyasına uğramadı. Dolayısıyla epey bir gecikme var. Ama biliyoruz ki sosyolojik dinamikler, sosyal dinamikler bastırılabilir ama durdurulamaz. Yani bazen bu çok basit bir bahaneyle, işte bir düdüklü tencereye benzetiyorum ben bunu. Yani basınç bazen çok fazla olur ama tencere sağlam olursa, baskı düzeni sağlam olursa bu patlamayabilir. Ama bazen bir çocuğun o düdüklü tencerenin sibabını yanlışla kaldırmasıyla bir kaza sonucu belki bütün ortalık işte yemek artığıyla vesaireyle dolabilir. Yani sosyal dinamikler burada söz konusudur. Bölge halkı ilk kez diğer taraflarda dünyanın diğer insanların yaşadığı gibi demokratik, özgür ve onurlu bir şekilde yaşamak istiyor. Bölgenin tabii ciddi sorunları var. Belki bir küresel bir dünyada yaşıyoruz aynı zamanda. Yani bir bölgede olan olaylar, gelişmeler diğer tarafları da etkiliyor. Ve dolayısıyla dünyadaki özgürleşme, sosyal medya birçok faktörde yine Arap dünyasındaki gençliğin, yeni neslin özellikle değişim ihtiyacını çok fazla yani istemelerine ve aynı zamanda bunu dile getirmelerine yol açıyor. Tabii bu çerçevede ben bir acizane giriş yaptıktan sonra konuşmasını yapmak üzere Mohammed Ayoob, Profesör Doktor Mohammed Ayoob'u konuşmasını için davet ediyorum. Please go ahead. Either way. We got 15 minutes and then 15 minutes.
Are you speaking in English?
Yes.
Of course.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'd also like to thank the organizers of the conference for inviting me to participate in this very important meeting. It's always a pleasure to visit Turkey and visit important institutions in this country, and I've been doing so for years. This is a particular pleasure that I'm here at Sakarya today. Since we have such limited time, I thought what I would do is talk about the Arab awakening, but not in much detail, or the Arab Spring as it used to be called, but not in much detail, but just to highlight a few themes that occurred to me as I was thinking about how I should put this presentation together. We know by now, if we didn't when the process started in late 2010, early 2011, that the Arab awakening, firstly, is while there is an interconnection between the various countries that have gone through these democratic transitions or attempted democratic transitions, that each individual case is very much an individual case. and that they are context-driven. So the outcomes are very context-driven as well. Secondly, we've also realized by now that this is a very complex process. It's not a unilinear one where we move from autocratic or authoritarian regimes to democratic ones, and then within a matter of weeks or at least a matter of months, things settle down and everything, as the Americans like to say, is hunky-dory. It's far from that. It's not a unilinear process. There are many bumps on the road, and it's an extremely complex process. But when I look at the total picture, what appears to me is that there is one, and this is a perennial issue in politics, in international and domestic politics, that seems to be surfacing time and again. And this is the issue of the tension between order and justice. Those of us who have been students of politics and of international relations have realized that unless order is any order, whether domestic or international, unless it incorporates within itself necessary elements of justice, it would remain unstable. But on the other hand, we also realize that demands for justice that do not take into consideration the requirements of order can easily lead to anarchy. And we are seeing this being played out, this tension being played out in the Arab world today. The tension between order and justice. In the more developed countries, more developed polities, I would say, rather than countries, the reason for successful transitions to responsive and responsible governments, first of all, have taken place over centuries. It was not too long ago that in North America and Europe, monarchies and absolute monarchies and authoritarian governments ruled the roost. It took centuries for them to come to a stage where one could call them responsive and responsible in terms of governance. But the reason, one of the main ingredients why this movement was successful was that they succeeded in reconciling the demands of order and justice. And this is what I think the Arab world is struggling with today, whether in Egypt or Syria or elsewhere, just to bring the legitimacy that justice brings to order, but at the same time to see that order is maintained so that these countries do not descend into anarchy. And some of them, I'm afraid, seem to be descending into anarchy. So this is a perennial issue in international politics and in politics in general that we see being played out in the Arab world today. The other point that I wanted to make was that while they are these, as I said earlier, these are individual cases that have their own domestic context in which democratic transitions are being attempted, they are not totally immune from regional and external influences. They are not immune particularly from what I like to call the regional Cold War that is going on in the Arab world or in the Middle East in general, not just the Arab world. The regional Cold War between Saudi Arabia on the one hand and Iran on the other. It's interesting to see that the Saudis, who on the one hand have been instrumental in suppressing the democratic, very instrumental in suppressing the democratic movement in Bahrain, on the other present themselves as the champions of democracy in Syria. One wonders whether one is living in an Orwellian world when Saudi Arabia becomes the champion of democracy. On the other hand, we see Iran, which has a very radical rhetoric in terms of its political rhetoric, and has been on the right side of history to begin with on most of the movements towards transformation in the Arab world, is the primary supporter, external supporter of the Syrian regime, of the Assad regime in Syria. So there is a major element of regional competition, regional Cold War, as I call it, that is going on in the Arab world today. And this regional Cold War, on the part of both of these primary protagonists, is driven very much by realpolitik. rather than by ideology. But it enormously complicates the situation in many of these countries, and Syria epitomizes that problem, as Syria epitomizes the problem of the tension between order and justice. Now, coming to Turkey's role in particular, I have I've had great sympathy for the Turkish dilemma in the context of the Arab uprisings, and Turkey has been once again on the right side of history under this government on most issues, but it has got itself caught up in a pretty messy situation, particularly in Syria. And this is where, I think it is essential for Ankara to make a determination as to where its interests really lie. It's very difficult for me to make suggestions from this podium, but I think a certain amount of rethinking is essential in Ankara on the issue of intervention and continuing intervention in Syria, which might drag Turkey into a quagmire from which it would be difficult for it to extract itself because of a host of issues that I've just written in detail in an article in The Guardian last week. But Turkey is geographically cannot delink itself from Syria. If things get messy or really nasty or chaotic or anarchic in Syria, the other supporters of the opposition, like Saudi Arabia and the United States, can go home. Turkey cannot go home because Turkey is located geographically next to Syria. So if Syria is in a mess, there is every possibility that the mess can be exported to Turkey as well. And I think that's a note that I wanted to bring out in my presentation today because I think it's very relevant to Turkey. The final point that I want to make is about American policy towards the Arab world in general, the Arab awakening in particular. There are, of course, as we all know, as students of politics and international politics, that there are many variables at play that impact the making of foreign policy in the major capitals of the world. And the United States is not an exception. So there are many variables that impact the United States, but there is one, what I would call is a constant in American policy, and that is to ensure Israeli predominance, military predominance in the Arab world, in this entire Middle Eastern region. So much of American policy, despite the rhetoric that is engaged in by the Secretary of State or the President or others, is driven by this need to not only protect but to enhance Israeli interests and to see that Israeli dominance in this part of the world is not eroded. And that brings me to my final point, returning to Turkey, that I consider, in the context particularly of this Arab awakening, that the two pivotal powers in the Middle East are Iran and Turkey. And it is essential for the stability of this region and to prevent the intrusion of external powers and to neutralize Israeli attempts at dominating this region, that Iranian-Turkish relations remain on an even keel. And that temporary setbacks, as over Syria or whatever else, are not allowed to, in the long term, impact negatively on Ankara's relations with Tehran. I think Prime Minister Erdogan and Foreign Minister Davutoglu have been doing a commendable job at trying to insulate differences over Syria from the larger issues of Iranian-Turkish relations. And I think there is also some reciprocity on the Iranian side. Vice President Rahimi was in Ankara just a day or two ago, and the talks seem to have gone well. But I think that relationship is the linchpin as far as stability in the broader Middle East is concerned, and as far as the need to prevent external negative influences in the region is also concerned. Thank you.
Teşekkürler Doktor Ayoob. Şimdi Profesör Ayooب'un söylediklerine birkaç noktaya dikkat çekmemiz gerekirse belki en önemlisi Türkiye özellikle Suriye sorunundan uzak kalamaz belki vurgusuydu. Çünkü biz Suriye'yi bıraksak bile oradaki sorun elden avuçtan çıkarsa, kontrolden çıkarsa Suriye'yi etkileyecek. İyi veya kötü biz hani uzaktan müdahale edenler gibi değiliz Türkiye. Sorun oradaki iyi veya kötü durum her halükarda bize etki edecektir. Yani bizim sorundan kaçmamız mümkün değildir diyor. Yine vurguladıkları noktalardan birisi Türkiye ile İran'ın bölgede önemli iki ülke oluşu. Yine bölgede İran'la özellikle Suudi Arabistan arasında bir soğuk savaş yaşanması. Yine sabit veya düzenin korunabilmesiyle adalet duygusunun dengelenmesi gerçekten bir zor bir olay. Bunu sağlamak kolay olmuyor çoğu zaman. Yani hem ülkelerin içinde bulundukları tekil örnekleri dikkate alarak hem de genel bölgesel ve küresel denklemi de içine alarak analizlerin yapılması gerektiğini vurguluyor. Thank you Profesör Ayoob. Şimdi sırada Profesör Doktor Udo Steinbach konuşmasını yapmak üzere kürsüye davet ediyorum.
Thank the organizers for inviting me to this event, which is a very timely one, given the fact that the Turkish foreign minister was unable to show up this morning due to a very critical situation along the Turkish-Syrian border. I would like to make 6 or 7 points, partly joining what previously has been said. Parts of them being of historic nature, parts of them looking forward and concentrating myself on what the European Union should do. After all, we are part of the game, not only due to the fact that we are neighbors to the Arab world, to Turkey and to Iran. So my first historical remark is a little bit what Dr. Ayoob said and what this morning the Turkish foreign minister said, Mr. Davutoglu. The term Arab Spring is the worst term to be applied to what is happening in the Arab world. For several reasons which I cannot go into, I call it the third Arab revolt. The first Arab revolt was immediately upon the end of the Ottoman Empire. So if we want to understand what happens in the Arab world today, we have to look back to the end of the Ottoman Empire, when after 4 centuries of being dominated by the Ottoman Empire, the Arabs were confronted with the question what to do with their future. So the first revolt was in 1918 until 1920 in various countries and among the Palestinians. The second, and it was quelled by European colonial powers. The second Arab revolt started with the Nasser revolution in 1952. It took approximately 2 decades, the 1950s and the 1960s. So many changes had taken place during these 2 decades, but at the end, the second Arab revolt, for reasons which I cannot go into, failed again. And now what we are seeing is that they are picking up upon the failure of the second Arab revolt to stage the third Arab world, the third attempt of the Arab world to find their place in the world. The second remark is even more general. Looking at what is happening, we come to the conclusion that the 20th century in the Middle East is a century of revolution, is not a century of autocracies, is not a century of boring stagnation. But when we start by 1905 with the Persian Revolution, 1908, the Young Turk Revolution, 1923, the Kemalist Revolution, and then we had the Iranian Revolution, and now we end up with the Arab revolts. We see that constantly, and this is close to what happened in Europe. All of us have been constantly looking for finding our places in the light of the fact that by 1918, history to some extent had ended. So the third remark is a reference to Turkey. Among all the people who belonged to the Ottoman Empire by the beginning of the 20th century, and still by more or less by the end of the First World War, starting from Libya to the Indian Ocean, it was only the people of Anatolia who succeeded to create a new stage a new political order which made them more or less independent and self-deciding until today. Only the people of Anatolia, I'm not talking about the Turks, I'm talking about the people of Anatolia, Turks and Kurds and others, who managed to cancel the plans of the European powers, who managed to stand up against Sèvres, and 3 years later, in 1923, to establish a political order. That did not happen in the Arab world. The Arab, as I said, the first Arab revolt failed. So Turkey became more or less the only self-confident and the only country which decided upon its fate alone, according to its own interest. That is very significant, and of course, it shows something about the role Turkey may play vis-à-vis the Arab revolt. Turkey has a long tradition of revolution. It has a long tradition of transition being moderated by the Turkish state. At the same time, it has a long tradition of a strong state, and especially after the Second World War, a continuing change being moderated by the state until today. That's why even there were breaks in the Turkish history, even there were setbacks, even there were sorts of struggle within Turkey, the Turkey moved forward, moderated by the state being represented by the judiciary, by the Kemalist system, by the military, or whatsoever. And this is different now with the Arab revolts. There is hardly any moderator. And that's why sometimes we feel that the Arab revolt may end up again in sort of chaos, as has been mentioned by the previous speaker. My fourth remark is on the European policy. Europe's policy to the Middle East, towards the Arab world, even to some extent towards Turkey, over the last 4 decades or 3 decades, has failed. We constantly supported the autocrats, and we were not at all aware that there were new political forces, new social forces, which started to change the political order. So our question is whether Europe, the EU, will understand what has happened, what is happening. So we have to understand that we have to adopt an inclusive attitude. The European community has to adopt an inclusive attitude instead of an exclusive attitude we have been adopting over decades. The Arab world, even Turkey, they were the others. They were seen to some extent as a threat, especially after 9/11. So we stood up to protecting ourselves in Europe against what was perceived as a threat stemming from the Arab world or from elsewhere. This is a perception we cannot no longer adopt. We have to see there are new forces, and we have adopted a new sort of policy, including, as I said this morning by Professor Finkelstein, including essentially the Palestinian issue. If there is no solution to the Palestinian issue, all those transition processes will be sooner or later in danger, and whether the European Union understands or does not understand what's happening will be seen whether they are adopting a new approach towards the Palestinian issue or not. So another point is what has to be done in the case of Syria. Strongly, personally, I have been against NATO intervention in Libya. Probably I have been wrong. There were very mistakes. There were many things that have been done wrongly by NATO. They have exceeded the mandate tremendously to the extent that the Russians and the Chinese are no longer willing to go along within the Security Council. But when it comes to Syria, I think for the first 6 months, the Syrians themselves, the people who stood up against the Bashar al-Assad regime, they were against foreign intervention. But now this is over. There has to be foreign intervention, not on the basis that happened in Libya, not the way it was carried out or it was misused in Libya, but in a different and more selective way. I think that to create a protective zone along the Turkish-Syrian border would be in order, and that a no-fly zone that has been applied in the case of Iraq, for example, by 1991, a no-fly zone would be a military achievement, and would encourage definitely the people in Syria that they have to stand up against the regime, and they are supported, that they get support, and that the EU, the international community, NATO, the United States, and others, that they definitely think that the regime of Bashar al-Assad has come to an end, and that would be a great achievement. And finally, we have to change our attitude towards Iran. Iran is a player, and we have practically everything made wrong over the last 10 years when it comes to Iran. To perceive Iran just as Mr. Ahmadinejad and what he's talking about, Israel and so on and so forth, to concentrate, to focus exclusively on the nuclear issue was wrong. We should open up our mind towards the Iranian society and see that it is a very dynamic society, and that change in Iran comes from the society itself and not under the influences of embargoes or whatsoever. And of course, when it comes to Syria and probably to other places in the Middle East, we have to engage Iran instead of exclude Iran and instead of confront Iran, as it has been done. And I think that the initiative to have 4 countries, Turkey, Iran, Saudi, and Egypt, to deal with the Syrian question is a very timely initiative. And finally, I think that the Arab world, after being under pressure, after being in move, that they should think not only to change the systems, but they should think of cooperation, economic cooperation. I think that the Arab world in principle is full of potential, but instead of using the potential, the rich ones for the less rich ones, to buy weapons for $140 billion is the wrong way to react to the Arab revolt. I think the EU should support the Arab world in showing the Arab world that there is a win-win situation to come closer to each other, to cooperate, and to exchange the potentials which exist in the various Arab states. And this is the end of my presentation. Thank you very much.
Biz de Profesör Steinbach'a teşekkür ediyoruz. Üçüncü Arap Baharı olarak adlandırdığı, bu Arap isyanı olarak adlandırdığı Arap Baharı veya bu değişimler sürecini özellikle Avrupa Birliği'nin İslam dünyasına, Türkiye dahil Arap dünyasına bakışında bir değişiklik olması gerektiğiyle, düşüncesiyle, ya dışlayıcı değil daha kapsayıcı bir tutum benimsemesi gerektiği vurgusuyla devam etti. Sonra da özellikle Suriye'de artık tıkanmış ve ezilen insanların dış askeri yardım olmadan, müdahale olmadan belki demokrasiye kavuşamayacaklarını, yine Batı'nın özellikle İran politikasının değişmesi gerektiğini, İran'ın da çözümün parçası haline getirilmesi vurgusuyla konuşmalarını sürdürdüler. Teşekkür ediyoruz. Şimdi sırada Profesör Doktor Berch Berberoglu. Buyursunlar. From University of Nevada, Reno. İngilizce konuşacaklar. Buyurun.
Thank you very much. First, I would like to thank the organizers of this conference for inviting me to take part in this important conference. And I am actually no stranger to Sakarya University. I was here earlier in the year, in February, to give a talk on globalization and the global economic crisis. And I'm glad to see many of you here again in this important conference. My previous colleagues gave a historical background to the conflict in the Middle East, especially the more recent developments with regard to the Arab Spring or Arab Awakening. And I'm sure today, tomorrow, and next few days, there will be many detailed presentations on the nature of the Arab Spring and developments in the Middle East in general. So, and also I have a session this afternoon that I'm chairing
on the Arab Spring, about 2:30 in the afternoon. I hope many of you will be able to join us to investigate in detail the nature of the most recent uprisings in the Middle East. So, I thought it would be more informative to give a little bit of a flavor and also the magnitude of the uprisings in the Middle East and North Africa, to provide you more or less of a photo essay combined with some text that I wanted to touch upon certain points. So I will present you some very lively photographs of the Arab Spring itself, blended in with some of the major points that I think are important to address in this context. So, as I said, I will title my presentation, I will hold it down to 15 minutes as much as I can, a photo essay. So, we have the North African and Middle Eastern geographic area extending from Morocco to Saudi Arabia in the east, and up to, obviously, to Syria, Iraq, and sometimes Turkey is also included. But if we're focusing on the Arab North Africa and the Middle East, we have the string of nations where these developments have taken place. Most importantly, in Tunisia, where it started, spread to Egypt, Yemen, and Bahrain, and other countries, including Lebanon and Jordan and Morocco, as well as, finally, Libya and now Syria, and a few others in the region. So it is extensive. It goes from the Atlantic Ocean to the Indian Ocean, basically, all across the Mediterranean, and it's a very big event. So let's take a look at the situation. This opening, I was going to present to you the depth in which some U.S. administrations have seen the importance and significance of the developments in the Middle East and the rise to these uprisings that these events may lead to, but we don't have time to read this in detail. I will provide this to you later, but basically it is provided by the National Security Advisor to the United States government during the Carter administration by Zbigniew Brzezinski, who basically summarizes the yearnings of the Arab people in terms of the transformations that they may be able to bring about because of the inequalities and the conflicts that this region has been witnessed to. So, in the interest of time, I will skip this portion of it to move forward with the countries in particular that is the subject matter of our talk. And, of course, you know these characters. I call it the dictatorship row. Four pathetic men, of course, laughing at themselves, unaware of what is in store for them in the near future. All these men are gone. New democratic forces have come to the fore, and the Middle East and North Africa is in the process of transformation. So, let's take a look at approaches to an understanding of the nature and causes of the rebellions and revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa by looking at types of regimes. Well, when we look at the situation in broader terms, we have neoliberal regimes with open-door policy towards foreign capital, impacted by globalization. These include Tunisia, Egypt, Morocco, Jordan, and Lebanon in terms of their relations to the West. Despotic regimes propped up by Western powers focused on Oil as a natural resource important to the West, Saudi Arabia, Yemen, Oman, Qatar, Bahrain, and so on, and closed civilian/military and fundamentalist religious dictatorships facing external subversion. Libya, as in the case of the European and US intervention from the outside. Syria, similarly, Western powers are meddling in that region and forcing Turkey into a difficult situation to enter a potential war. Iraq, of course, the invasion of the United States. Iran, the threats that are leveled against it. And Algeria, historically, now in terms of religious forces in the aftermath of the Algerian Revolution in the 1950s. So, let's take a look at some crucial questions on the rebellions and revolutions in the Middle East and North Africa. Causes and consequences. What were the underlying causes of the rebellions and revolutions? This is a very important question. If we don't understand the causes and try to understand finally the consequences, we will not be in any position to understand the developments that have been taking place there. What factors have precipitated these rebellions and revolts? Very important. What are the internal and external factors that have contributed to these uprisings? What role has neoliberal globalization and the global economic crisis has played in these revolutions? As you recall, Greece is in the midst of a major economic depression, and many of the people demonstrating there for the last 2 to 3 years, most recently a few days ago, have characterized their movement inspired by the Arab Spring over the last 2 years of the major activities taking place there. What are the nature, dynamics, and contradictions of these revolutions and uprisings? Internal social dynamics. Who are the leading social forces? And what role have various organizations played in these revolutions? Not just in Egypt, with Muslim Brotherhood and so on, but others as well. What are the ideological framework of these rebellions? What are the ideological framework of not only these rebellions, but also the neighboring countries giving support or withholding support from them? What have been the role of the military and the security forces, as in the case of Egypt, for example, when there were clashes between the demonstrators and the police first, and the military subsequently, especially after the inauguration of the new president? What are the prospects for social change and social transformation in the aftermath of these revolutions? What directions will these rebellions and uprisings take? Very important. I might personally not have the answers to all of these, but these are the questions that we need to ask and address. External factors, response of the big powers, the United States and Europe. The threat of intervention, as in Libya and Syria. Links with the military, police, and security forces. Links to political parties and organizations. Covert operations and subversion by CIA, Mossad, and others. Sanctions, embargoes, propaganda, and so forth. Aid to pro-Western groups, infiltration of opposition groups, and so on. Very important. So, let's start with the Tunisian Revolution. As you know, the Tunisian Revolution was triggered by the hero, I would call, of this revolution and of the Arab Spring, Mohammed Bouazizi. He set himself on fire. That sparked across the sky in North Africa and the Middle East what became, I believe, the Arab Spring. The public suicide of Mohammed Bouazizi, the unemployed engineer with a master's degree in Tunisia, that ignited the Arab Spring of 2011. When Mohammed couldn't find a job, he decided to buy a cart to sell fruits in the streets. When the government confiscated his cart and fruits became well, because he wasn't licensed to sell. He became, in the streets, he set himself on fire as a last resort, being unemployed and tried to start his own small business, but was now in a very dire situation. Mohammed Bouazizi is the tragic hero of this revolt. By setting himself on fire, he crystallized the grievances of the Tunisian masses, says Graham Douglas. His death was a beginning symbolizing the opposition of the system that betrayed the people and served a tiny elite around Ben Ali, and his response to daily humiliation by the authorities encapsulates the true spirit of the Arab revolt, he concludes. After Mohammed's death, tens of thousands of people in Tunisia took to the streets. Their cry was, "Stop the repression in the Maghreb." And many, many thousands of people throughout Tunisia engaged in massive disobedience and protests. The government of Ben Ali is finally overthrown, and he flees, guess to where? Saudi Arabia. The Tunisian Revolution was the spark, as I mentioned, that ignited the rebellions and revolutions across North Africa and the Middle East. In the case of the bread riots, which took place a few decades back, which spread across the Maghreb from Tunis to Algiers to Rabat, the recent uprisings in Tunisia was the trigger that brought down the regimes from Egypt to Yemen to Libya to Syria. The most memorable, of course, of these has been the Egyptian Revolution. The magnitude of the Egyptian Revolution is such that we will see in a few minutes many millions of people across many cities in Egypt, especially in Cairo, El Tahrir Square, where people took part. Following the assassination of Anwar Sadat, Hosni Mubarak established a dictatorship in Egypt that lasted more than 3 decades. The people are impoverished in Egypt up through this period, most making less than $2 a day, while millions are unemployed at the edge of starvation and trying to survive. The military kept tab on all opposition to the regime, while Mubarak and his cronies won elections with 99% of the vote, calling it a democracy. But the people are defiant and refuse to live under dictatorship and repressive rule. The trigger of an eruption to ignite the people's revolution in Egypt becomes the uprisings in Tunis and the other Arab states. As the Tunisian revolution spread across Africa and Arab Middle East, millions of Egyptians take to the streets to protest against the corrupt regime. The people are on the march. The Egyptian people rise up against the Mubarak dictatorship, and the repressive regime is overthrown in less than a few weeks. That's Tahrir Square, where for weeks and weeks we observed on television the determination of the Egyptian people facing the police and the military and not surrendering their peaceful and democratic uprising. Protests, demonstrations, and rebellions across the Middle East spread, and North Africa, in Yemen, in Bahrain, more than 100,000 taking to the streets, March of the Loyalty to Martyrs, honoring demonstrators killed by the security forces on February 22nd. Morocco, Lebanon, Palestine, Libya, Syria. Now, in all of this, the role of the social media was very important. Facebook, Twitter, and the rest, and all of you are familiar with this. And here is a scene from Egypt. Another one, the power of media, in this case, the internet, bringing down military dictators. As you know, Mubarak and others came from the military. Facebook, Twitter, and other social media played an important role in facilitating communication between people regarding strategy and tactics of the rebellions and revolutions, place and time of protests and demonstrations, pooling resources and exchanging information about troop movements, positioning of security forces, building alliances and solidarity among various groups, getting the message out about the uprising to the outside world, all through the internet. Here are some scenes from the use of Facebook in Tunisia, Egypt, and other places. Very importantly, women played a very central role in the rebellions and revolutions in the Middle East. As the saying goes, women hold half the sky. This is very important because women in Islamic countries are characterized as very conservative, under the control of their husbands, and so forth. But as you'll see from some of the photographs that I have, they played an extremely powerful role in turning out in the streets in the rebellions that brought about the changes that we have experienced. Women have played an active role in the region, across the region, by taking part in protests and demonstrations, through their affiliation with various civic and religious organizations, by using social media to communicate with others in the movement, by applying their skills to advance the revolutionary cause, and by actively being involved in the mass movement. Here are some scenes. Tunisia, Egypt, elsewhere. And thank you very much.
Profesör Berch Berberoglu'na biz de teşekkür ediyoruz. Hızlıca birkaç noktaya değinmek gerekirse, Arapların değişim isteği yeni değil ama bu gecikmiş bir süreç olduğunu vurguluyor. Ayrıca rejim türleri daha karmaşık bir olgu olarak ele alınması gerektiğini, burada birçok sosyal kesimin rolü olduğunu, rejim türlerine göre, açık veya kapalı olmalarına göre bu devrimlerin farklı şekilde geliştiğini söylüyor. Bir sosyolog olarak da devrimler karmaşık olgulardır, ortaya çıkmaları zordur. Burada hani sadece kızgınlıkla, hatta komplo ile hiç açıklanamaz da, yani sadece kızgınlıkla işte insanların ne kadar bastırılırsa ondan sonra patlayacağı fikriyle değil, fırsatların olması gerekiyor, kaynakların olması gerekiyor. Tunus'ta mesela genç okumuş bir neslin, işsiz bir neslin olması, yani ne yapacağını bilen bir Twitter gençliği, sosyal medya gençliğinin olduğunu bize gösteriyor. Tabii bu süreçte söylem, diyalog, rejimle halk arasındaki ilişkiler, her şey rol oynuyor. Kısaca Profesör Berberoglu'nun ortaya attığı sorular da aslında bu konferansın çok ilgiyle izleneceğini, çok temel sorulara cevap aranacağını, bu ilginç tartışmalar yapılacağını gösteriyor. Özellikle yani vaktimiz dar olduğu için soru alamayacağız. Çünkü konuşmacılarımız aynı zamanda panel başkanı olarak diğer oturumlarda görev alacaklar. O sürede sorular kendilerine iletilebilir. Öğleden sonraki oturumlar 14.30'da başlayacak. Bundan şimdi yemekhanede yemek var çıkışta, üniversitenin yemekhanesinde. Ayrıca ben bir Sakaryalı olarak dışarıda görev yapsam da, yani güzel memlekette, memleketimizin Görenazır kampüsünde böyle güzel bir konferans ilgiyle ilgilendiği için ayrıca tebrik etmek istiyorum. Bir de özellikle Kemal İnat Hoca'nın, Profesör Doktor, Orta Doğu çalışmalarının, özellikle genç arkadaşlar tabii uzatmadan, Orta Doğu'ya büyük ilgi olduğunu görüyorum. Yani burada 4 dilde master programı var. Ayrıca üniversitemizde buradaki Orta Doğu çalışmalarını çok önemsiyor. Orta Doğu'dan gelen arkadaşların da, akademisyenlerin de ayrıca katkısı olacaktır. Yani bölgeyle çok daha yakın bir ilişki içerisine gireceğimizi tahmin ediyorum. Hepinize teşekkür ediyorum.